Okay, you know I am. Oh, Blum. Okay, Blum if you're European. So my idea is, for today and tomorrow, is I'm going to read you a paper, a historical paper, about the history of the Two Truths teaching from India to the Meiji period. And of course, special emphasis on what happens in Japan and then what happens in Shinshu. And then tomorrow, a reading session in the morning, we'll be reading one of the essays from the Seishin Shugi book called by Kyozawa, called, I forgot the English translation, Monks, Why Don't You Respect Yourselves More, or something like this. So, somebody's afraid of that. And anyways, I think that ties very much into this. So, and the reason, hopefully will become clear after I talk about it a bit, is the fact that Kyozawa has a very critical approach to Shinshu culture as a whole. Higashi Honganji, his own church specifically, and that essay, which is written at the end of his life, in which he's particularly critical of his own church, his own, the Buddhists in Japan as a whole, very much reflects his frustration, I think, with what's happening around him. And I believe very much it's not only Kyozawa's voice we're looking at, but that of Japanese Buddhism as a whole. And so it's quite a biting essay, and therefore I think very valuable. So let me just also say that essays like this are rare in the Buddhist tradition. We have polemic writing, that is writing criticizing other Buddhists or other schools or other interpretations. We have a lot of polemic writing in India. We have less of it, but we also have it in China. Nichiren was a very strong polemical writer, and Shinran has a polemical side to him as well, without question. Now, for many people, that's part of the strength of Shinran. We'll talk about that again tonight. I'll mention that. That kind of polemical writing typically, again, is in regard to other people in the same church, you might say, the same religion. What are Buddhists doing? Your Buddhism, you have to justify it. So, for example, in Tibet today, the debating tradition is still very strong. I was just discussing with a Tibetan teacher a couple weeks ago about the fact that now they're beginning to finally train women in Tibet to have the same educational and debating skills as men, but they haven't let the women debate with the men yet. Okay? So, you know, I guess what I'm getting to here is, what is the value of debate, right? Why is it necessary to have critical voices within a tradition, without a tradition? Why Buddhists gain a lot from talking to people from other religions, et cetera, et cetera? And has to face the Buddha. Anyway, and okay, so that's the background. I just want to say one thing before I start, before I get into the history. And this is something that occurred to me last night that I've been wanting to say for a long time, and perhaps I said it to some of you in private. And this is kind of it's not a critique, but it's just kind of an overview from my perspective. And this is something that I think I touched on in the meeting in LA, in the East Meets West meeting in January. But I just want to throw this out there as a topic, perhaps for the discussion. I think this is something that probably all of you are somewhat aware of, so it shouldn't be completely new, but maybe this clarification, if it is clarification, might help. And that is, what does it mean to be a member of Shinshu today? Well, we're standing here in California, so we're in the United States. That's so immediately the first thing we think of is that we're in a different context than where this religion came from. Now that doesn't mean that religion can't function. Religions move across cultural and national boundaries all the time, and linguistic boundaries all the time. But of course, every time a religion moves across a cultural and linguistic boundary, things inevitably change. It can't be helped. And in some sense, that process of change is fraught with difficulty, fraught with opportunities. You can make it better. But we have to ask what is gained and what is lost. And I think thinking about this can be very helpful. So, last night when I was thinking about this, I wasn't thinking immediately about the current situation right now, but I was thinking what happened in the Meiji period. I mean, essentially, this paper is about the Meiji period. I just got finished teaching a seminar on Japanese literature and religion in the Meiji period, and the Meiji period is so deep in modern Japanese thinking. It's impossible to think about, and this, of course, is when Shinju comes to America, right? So the Meiji period is at the background of everything, it seems to me, that Japanese religion in America does. It is. You can't separate the two. And Meiji consciousness, just like the Issei generation that first came over, as you all know, it's a different way of thinking, a different set of priorities, a different set of values, a different set of morals and obligations and relationship between the individual and the collective and the group, et cetera, et cetera. All this is disrupted by the war, of course, but let's go way, way back further. First, let's just think about what happened in the Meiji period within Japan. And the first thing that happened is you have suddenly a whole new educational set of priorities. Suddenly, the second language that everybody has to learn to succeed in life is not Chinese, it's English or German. Right? The result is that as you look at Meiji literature, and you look at Japanese literature coming from the early Meiji period, the mid-Meiji period, the Taisho into Showa, what happens? The use of Chinese decreases and decreases and decreases. Japan is pulling away from China as its kind of cultural big brother, its senpai in a way. By the time we get to the post-war period, of course, the amount of Chinese language studied in Japanese schools today is minimal. 1 or 2 years in middle school, that's about it. So, well, it's not just that the Chinese cultural traditions become removed from the everyday concerns of Japanese people, but specifically, we talk about Buddhism. The scriptures are in Chinese. There were no Japanese translations of Buddhist sutras until the Meiji period. It was always in Chinese. Everybody did everything in Chinese. And we have this very odd text, for example, called koshiki. Koshiki were musical performances of Buddhist rituals. This is a Heian period thing, okay? So I'm talking 12th, 13th century. So they really become popular in the, 1150s, 1160s. It's a big deal in Kyoto and Nara. And we suddenly have all these koshiki written, and this go on in Kamakura and Moromachi as well. But the odd thing about koshiki is they are musically performed. We know that they're musical rituals. They were not just people chanting things. They were done to music, and they were sung. And they were sung in Japanese. Because it was a vernacular communication. But the texts we have are all written in Chinese. All of these are written by Japanese educated monks writing in Chinese, and they were all performed in Japanese. The idea today is inconceivable. Why would you write it in Chinese and why not just write it in Japanese? Well, that's because in 1150, nobody wrote Buddhism in Japanese. It just wasn't done. Honen, as far as I know, is the first person to write any kind of a Buddhist essay in Japanese. Now that changed. Once the door gets open to that, someone like Dogen writes almost everything in Japanese. But that's already 13th century. In the 12th century, that really wasn't done. So think about that. Think about a ritual performative tradition with music that everybody came to see. There was a very popular. There are a lot of koshi. There are hundreds of them. All of them that we have, all the texts are extant, are in Chinese. And yet we know they were all performed in Japanese. It's a kind of linguistic miracle in a way, but at the same time it shows the degree to which the norm of Chinese as the language of Scripture, even the language of performance of Scripture, that you write yourself, not somebody coming from China, from India, still had to be Chinese. That's the intimacy that Japan had with Chinese language. We get into the Meiji period, it's cut. It's cut, and what's it replaced with? Some kind of English. But we see the degree to which the Japanese culture has struggled with English, right? In the course of the modern period, it's been a difficult one. Everyone knows this. So, one of the difficulties of the whole economic trouble that Japan is in is because the world economy has shifted to a digital model, right? And Japan has not succeeded in this, and partly it's because they don't have the English skills, because the computer languages are all in English. So, this takes time. That's my point. So you have, on the one hand, you have this one shift in Japan from Chinese as a background, secondary form, the cultural support of what you're doing, to English being the cultural support, but this kind of insecurity with English. And then in the case of Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism continues to be based on Chinese scriptures. Now they're all translated into Japanese, but that's a new shift that's happening, right? So the rituals don't work in the same way they did before. Now then we say, okay, well, so let's put this on a boat and fly and sail to San Francisco. Okay. So now we come to San Francisco, and now we have, so there's kind of a diluting in the sense of illusion. I'm saying there's a diluting of the power of the scriptures when they go from Sanskrit to Chinese, in some sense, and then when they go from Chinese to Japanese. It's not identical. There's some change that happens. Now, if you're really diligent about this, you don't lose anything, but you have to really be tough. You have to be careful what you're doing. I read a lot of Chinese Buddhist materials, and I read a lot of Japanese writing about them, and I read what they call kakikudashi, Japanese translations into classical Japanese of Chinese sutra material, and some of it's good and some of it's dreadful, just dreadful. I mean, it's clearly ungrammatical, unreadable as Chinese, bad scholarship. But in Japan, kakikurashi wa nandemoi, you can do anything you want. Because you gotta make sense out of it, So they make sense out of it any way they can. There's a tradition, I understand that. We do the same thing, I'm doing it in English. I can make sense of stuff. I'm sure some of my writing is terrible also. I'm just saying again, something has changed in the process. Now we bring this over here and we're gonna put this into English. Okay, so how much of this tradition gets put into English? Not much. This is a huge burden, right? We want to make this a kind of, not just an American thing, but a world thing. I mean, at this point, we're poised to make Pure Land Buddhism a world religion. Buddhism is already a world religion, but Pure Land is not quite on board yet. I recently got an email from one of these Dharma magazines, I don't know, one of them I never, there's a whole bunch of them now, right? And they asked me, Paul White has written a book on Yasuda Ornithin, sort of mid-20th century Shinshu philosopher type, who met Tillich and studied Heidegger and this kind of things. And he asked me if I could write a little review of the book for the journal. He said, and we'd like to get, he said, people don't know how to make sense of this because it's Pure Land and we don't expect to see philosophy in Pure Land. So could you please write something for the journal? He says, a lot of people want to know how Pure Land works. So this is sort of popular American Buddhism with no connection to Pure Land, and they don't have anyone to dialogue with, right? So, okay, back to this is part of the story. Part of the problem is that we have this continual shift in perspective. So now we have the BCA in America for over 100 years, and we have some material put into English. As far as I know, there's no translation to Kyogo Shinsho until after the war, right? The Yamamoto Kosho's translation, I think, was the first one in the 50s or something, and everybody didn't like that. And it took, Ryukoku and Nishihonganji a long time to come up with their translation. So all this stuff, again, my point is that it seems to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, okay? So as things get smaller and smaller, it means the burden on all of you people gets bigger and bigger because you have less to work with. You don't have all this material that everybody else has always had. You can't point to this sutra and to that sutra and ask people to use it for reference because it doesn't exist for them. you know, I did a workshop on the Nirvana Sutra here at Berkeley in January. And I was contacted by a friend of mine who teaches at Princeton, and he said, Mark, why don't you take the papers in the workshop and publish a kind of textbook of it? So Princeton, this guy Buzzy Tyser, he started a series of take famous Buddhist scriptures and get essays written about them, use them as a basis for teaching undergraduates. So like the Lotus Sutra is a famous sutra, right? So then we have a bunch of essays on the Lotus Sutra and art and cult literature, et cetera, et cetera. And then we can not only use that to teach all sorts of things about Buddhism, but then they have reference to learn a sutra as well. I said, that's a great idea. And then I talked to the publisher. The publisher's really happy that I would try this. So I told everybody coming to the conference, see if you can write a paper that we can somehow publish as a book and make it a textbook, right? Then we have the Nirvana Sutra function that way. And then we had the conference, and after it was over, everybody said, forget about it. This ain't never going to work. Number one, the translation's incomplete. I've only done 1/4 of it, right? What are they going to use for reference? And all these other complicated doctrines that are in the sutra, we don't have English language materials yet for people to reference, right? So that project was sort of pushed aside. My point here is that as the tradition gets whittled down a little bit, it inevitably gets simplified, right? And the simplifications become symbolic. You see what I'm saying? In some sense, symbolic representations of a bigger whole. Got it? But if you don't have access to that bigger whole, and most people don't, then you've got to deal with the symbols. You've got to deal with symbolic representations. You've got to deal with, the Tani Sho, chapter 3, only evil people are the object of the Buddha's vow. Well, what the hell does that mean? You know, there's all this commentary material on it that's not been translated and nobody knows about. So that makes your job that much harder, I have to say. And I have great sympathy. Really, I feel that this is, in some sense, a kind of unfair burden and yet a tremendous opportunity, but it's difficult. It really is difficult. And in some sense, the more you can bring in what is a very huge, rich tradition, somehow, the more of this we can get into English, the more there is to talk about, right? Then the more discussion you can have, and I think the more exciting the whole thing will be. So in some sense, that's what I'm sort of dedicated my life to doing, is to bring more of this material out. But there's a lot, And Shinshu and Shinshu-related studies in Japan is still a huge, huge endeavor. There's so many people working on it, and so few people over here working on it. And I just don't, I just feel like so I'm trying to do stuff for Jodo Shu and Jodo Shinshu. It's like, oh my God. Where's everybody else? Anyway, so this is all background to the two truths theory. Why am I interested in this? Why is this relevant? Well, this is one of the major shifts that happens in late Edo Meiji period Buddhism, where a certain view of the two truth theory gets twisted and redefined in a way that becomes politically expedient for both Honganjis, okay? And that's unfortunately the burden that you guys all have, because that's the Buddhism, that's the Shin tradition that came here. So I'm going to give you a background to where this comes from, what the original teaching was, how and when it got reformed, and then what Kyozawa's critique of it is, okay? That's basically. All right. So I beg your indulgence because the first part of the paper is very historical and does not seem to be directly related to Shinshu or Shin. We're going to go back to India here, okay? And we're going to go through Chinese Buddhism. But let's start with Kyozawa. So, any student of Kyozawa is aware of his rather radical turn against prevailing Buddhist normative discourse on morality during the last few years of his life. Of particular interest is the way he seems to have found a new voice on this topic after being diagnosed with tuberculosis, a diagnosis that would prove fatal, suggesting a major personal transformation occurred in him as well. That is, his later writings are not only unusually inspired in their creativity and existential honesty, but also differ significantly from his earlier writings on the same subject. The fact that he used the Buddhist theory of two truths to frame his critique of Buddhist notions of worldly morality in his time is, however, in my estimation, of far more lasting significance than his deconstruction of socially prevailing norms of morality and ethics in Japanese society. I say this because long before Kyozawa's courageous statements on the two truths were published, the Shinshu sect, especially the Honganji branch, because remember, it's not just Nishi, Higashi, Honganji, we have Bukkoji, and we have, Senjuji and lots of other branches of Shinshu, had long since established its own rather unique hermeneutic of the two-truth doctrine that all but obliterated any meaningful distinction between church and state. So that's the key thing to keep in mind here. In what way does Buddhism, the Buddhist theory of truth, rest on the distinction between church and state? All right, we can talk about that later. This paper is an attempt to grasp the intellectual process by which Shin Buddhist intellectuals took the Shin doctrinal discourse in a direction that redefined both absolute and worldly truths, but will inevitably focus on the famous and or infamous Shin move that applied the King's Law and Buddha's Law paradigm to the Buddhist paradigm of two truths, thereby removing them from their purely religious context, and pose the question of why Shin became committed long before Kyozawa to this, what is essentially an anomalous interpretation of the Buddhist Dharma. What the implications are for Buddhism as a whole, and why Kyozawa not merely deconstructed, but effectively trashed the presumptions of his church that give rise to and substantiated what amounts to a highly politicized apologetic for the very existence of Jodo Shinshu in Japanese society. Some have even seen the shift in late 19th century Shin thought as inevitable. It is well known that Japanese Buddhism in the Meiji period underwent a rather severe weaning from its feudalistic cultural parent, mostly in response to its persecution, that is the persecution of Buddhism, in the early years of the Meiji government when ideologues controlled government policy. As the militarization of society and culture progressed apace until midway into the 20th century, almost regardless of who was actually running things, government antipathy toward Buddhism remained strong, even if it did not revert to the overt suppression of early Meiji. Responses within the professional Buddhist communities to this pressure manifested both institutionally and doctrinally. But surely one of the most bizarre was the peculiar adaptation of the Buddhist theory of two truths within the leadership of Jodo Shinshu, whereby the worldly truth was redefined as one's duty to the state, and the highest truth was redefined as an interior Taiki faith in the Pure Land teachings as defined by Edo period sectarian studies, or Shukai. Essentially, this position amounts to Buddhism in Japan ceding an enormous piece of intellectual and cultural territory to whatever the prevailing norms of ethical and political obligations are current or afoot in society at any given time. There had been a great deal of Japanese scholarship on this topic in the post-war period, particularly since the 1990s, though very little, almost nothing, has been published in English that examines these issues critically, particularly in terms of Buddhist history as a whole. It is important here to stress how anomalous this move was, and part of what I will attempt to do here is show this fact. But this outsider response of Honganji to modernity begs the question as to why this move only characterizes the modern form of Shin Buddhism. That is, I looked, and the other schools of Buddhism in Japan are not doing this. So this raises all sorts of other questions, of course, beyond what we have to think about here. In other words, why all forms of Buddhism, although all forms of Buddhism were under attack or suspicion in the 19th century in Japan, only Shin came up with this form of rationalization for its social identity in the new modern Japanese state. Discussions of this problem among Shin scholars usually begin with noting that the absolute nature of emperor-centered political system of thought in the early Meiji period raised such serious questions about the viability of Buddhism in modern Japan that some form of accommodation was unavoidable. As I see it, all systems of thought were being, were being turned into ideology in the Meiji period, at least as far as the policy goes. But in fact, this new paradigm dates back perhaps 50 years prior to the Meiji Restoration. I am not only drawing on the histrionic anti-Buddhist rhetoric of Hirata Atsutane, who some of you may know, most of you probably don't know. Hirata Atsutane's dates are 1777 to 1843. Hirata Atsutane was the most vocal and most influential anti-Buddhist intellectual of the late Edo period. The persecution of Buddhism in the early years of Meiji, and if you're not aware of this, the persecution was not merely rhetorical, but Buddhist land was complicated. Temples were burned down, books were burned, images were burned. It was a very serious matter. The people that promoted that policy and the implementation of that policy were all people who considered themselves in Hirata Atsutane's line. Okay. I'm not only drawing on the anti-Buddhist rhetoric of Hirata Atsutane, but also to the writings of Shin intellectuals themselves throughout the first half of the 19th century, especially that of a Higashi Honganji priest called Shokai. I'll talk about him later, and with hints of the same even earlier. But this does not necessarily help us deal with the question of why Shinshu. To fully grasp what it was about Shin culture in the Edo period that led to this sort of a combination and what its consequences were, we need to know what part of this legacy belongs to Shin Buddhism and what part can be found elsewhere. Okay, let's go back to India now. The basic theory of the two truths in Buddhism is most famously traced back to Nagarjuna. So in Nagarjuna's Churon is a Japanese name, the Mula Madhyamaka Kalika Shastra. This is discussed in great detail, but actually it's older than Nagarjuna. The idea is that the meanings or understandings of things have two forms. Either that as we understand them in terms of worldly rationality, worldly truth. Second, okay, that is, and those understandings are transient because the world is transient, okay. Or we understand them in terms of meanings that transcend this world, that is, that are permanent. The Sanskrit word for that is lokottara, loka uttara, shiseken in Japanese. This view also appears in Middle Period Mahayana sutras as a way to explain the doctrinal variance between Mahayana and non-Mahayana messages. And there's a very famous passage on this in the Nirvana Sutra as well. Nirvana Sutra today is understood to predate Nagarjuna, by the way. In Fascicle 13 of the Nirvana Sutra, relatively simple directives, the relatively simple teachings taught by the Buddha, such as discerning the cause of suffering, he labels middle wisdom, connected with what he calls worldly truth. And the more difficult truths he calls the first truth, higher wisdom. This amounts to a two-tiered hermeneutic of the Four Noble Truths themselves. One based on a rational analysis of causality and that yields sharp discrimination, the other one based on grasping the transcendent unity and internal nature of the higher truth. So what this means is that the worldly truth, as taught in the Nirvana Sutra, therefore, is that discrimination. I'll hold this. So, in other words, fumbetsu in Japanese, vikalpa in Sanskrit. So, normal thinking involves discrimination, right? You choose this thing versus that thing. That's how you succeed in life. You know how to use your judgment, right? The longer you live, hopefully the better your judgments get. You make better decisions. You end up with more successful. Your life becomes more efficient because you don't waste time on stuff. So that is the worldly approach. The Buddhist teachings themselves are put into that category. Why? The Buddhist teachings may originate from a transcendental, permanent source, but as we have them, we understand them as impermanent beings that we are. All of us are aging. All of us, our minds don't work the same way today that they worked 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Maybe better, maybe worse, I don't know. But in any case, this is all transient. That's the point. So the worldly truth is inevitably divisive, discriminatory, okay? Because that's the way our lives work. When you talk about Buddhism as part of society, society is discriminatory, divisive as well. We make distinctions, right? Now, the higher truth is the opposite. It's about unity. It's about the fact that from the perspective of nirvana, we don't see individual beings. We don't see individual things. We don't give a shit if it's choice A or choice B. Choice A and choice B are not separate. They're mutually dependent. They're connected. It's the connection that is dominant in the higher truth, okay? It's the separation that's dominant in the worldly truth. So the teachings of Buddhism, when they teach about this transcendent unity, the problem is we understand it in our discriminatory minds, right? Because that's the way we go through life. So it's that paradox, that contrast, that, in a sense, there's a kind of conflict there, and that's what makes it so difficult, okay? That's why we have the two-truth theory, right? So we have Buddhism that exists in both ways at the same time, both with using discrimination and without discrimination, okay? But to think without any discrimination at all, for most people, is completely impossible. That's why we're not, maybe some of you, but I'm not a Buddha, right? So we're not Buddhas. We go through life as in our limited way. I have to stand here. May get some noise. Okay. So Sanskrit terms of this are Paramartha and Samvriti. You don't need to know that, but anyway, Paramartha is the higher, Parama Artha, the higher truth, okay, the first truth, and Samvriti is sort of worldly or temporary. If we only know the Dharma in the mundane analytic way, how can we hope to achieve transcendental understanding? The answer lies in the fact that the mundane truth and the transcendental truth are somehow no different, are somehow not separate from each other. It's all Buddhism. That's precisely how Nagarjuna talks about it. Okay, so let me give you a quote from the Nirvana Sutra to see if this makes any sense. At that point, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, and Manjushri addressed the Buddha, world honored one. The ultimate meanings of this worldly truth that you have expounded, what does it mean? World honored one, does the ultimate meaning contain the worldly truth? Does the worldly truth contain the ultimate meaning? If so, then there is only one truth. If not, then could the Tathagata have spoken falsely by separating the two? Good man, the Buddha answers. The worldly truth is the same as the ultimate meaning, the ultimate truth. Manjushri answers, world honored one, if that's the case, then there are two truths. Good man, I have, by means of using skillful means, explained that there are two truths in accordance with the understanding of living beings. If I expound things accordingly, then there will be two kinds of Dharma, a Dharma for the world and a Dharma for what is beyond the world. Just as the Dharma for the person who understands what lies beyond this world is called ultimate truth, what a worldly person understands, I call worldly truth. Okay, so this basic teaching comes to China by the second quarter of the 5th century, and the Japanese terms for this are Shintai and Zokutai, if you know Japanese, okay? And all the major influential Chinese thinkers, such as Chigi and Kichizo, everybody talks about this in some sense throughout all their work. So Japanese Buddhism is sort of based on this doctrine from the very beginning. But at the same time, the rhetoric concerning the two truths begins to shift slightly in Chinese Buddhist thought. There is a shift because of what are called apocryphal sutras or indigenous sutras. That is, when Chinese Buddhism really gets established, what happens? We have new sutras being written by the Chinese people themselves. This is quite noticeable in the 6th century and the Kangyo, for example. The Contemplation Sutra is one of those sutras. It's clearly written by the Chinese. It has very strong Indian roots, but it cannot come from India in the form that we have it. And this is a way to kind of take this teaching and massage it in a way that makes it easier to understand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So let's... By the time of Shinran, intimate relations between Buddhist institutions and the state had at least 5 centuries of precedent. That relationship was commonly referred to as one of mutual dependence. By the 12th century in Japan, it is not uncommon to see reference to what is called the Buddha's law and the king's law, Obo Bukko, as described as 2 wings of a bird or 2 wheels of a cart, neither of which has any hope of success without the other. The bird can't fly with only 1 wing. Okay, the Buddha's law and the king's law. That's because Dharma is translated as law, right? And of course, the directive from the government, that's law also. So that's where these things fit together very conveniently. Shinran does not discuss any particular theory of the two truths, but he alludes to the concept, and we can assume that he was well aware of the complex precedent within his circle of his speech community. There is wide agreement today that the Shinshu normative stance of redefining the two truths as King's Law, Buddha's Law, was not a position advanced by Shinran, but grew out of Shinran's later followers, such as particularly Kakunyo, Zonkaku, Renyo, and Edo period sectarian studies. The seeds of this change can also be traced to Shinran's employment of the Mappo Tomyoki, which is a text that appears suddenly in the early Kamakura period, which Shinran quotes almost in its entirety in the Kishindo chapter of the Kyoryo Shinsho. The Mappo Tomyoki is attributed to Saito, but does not appear until the early Kamakura period, so the attribution is rarely accepted today, but we have no idea of how Shinran actually regarded the text. In any case, Shinran's views of the norms of society are very clear in that he's quite critical. So even though Shinran doesn't talk about this specifically, it's very clear that his position is that the Buddha's teachings must assume priority as Buddhists. That is our job, to promote the Buddhist teachings first. So Shinran's famous for telling his followers that going to Shinto shrines to observe Shinto rituals is a waste of time. And at the same time, Shinran says, I don't say the Nembutsu for my parents, okay? He's also saying, don't spend your time on all this other stuff. It's not going to help you, okay? So in this sense, it's very interesting. Shinran and Nichiren have very parallel positions, which is that Buddhism's role is to stand outside society as a corrective to society. That's the role of, that's how Buddhism contributes to the country, is by correcting the mistakes of the country. And if Buddhism gets too close to the political power of society, then Buddhism loses that voice, and then the society suffers as well, okay? So the Nichiren tradition and the Shinshu tradition are very distinct in this way. In the very beginning, they did not make political accommodations with the state. They were continually suppressed, persecuted. You all know this. Nichiren's followers were continually hounded, just like Shinshu was. Their temples burned down. They had all sorts of trouble. Various kind of charges against them were invented to justify this, but it's basically, I think, for the same reason. Whereas Honen's group had trouble at first, but then it became quite accepted into the upper levels of society. Now, so, all right, let me just, without going into the details of how this changes, with Kakunyo and Zonkaku, these are the kind of medieval, famous intellectual voices of interpretation of Shinran. We have a kind of moving away from that, a kind of radical, extreme view of Shinran. And when we get to Renyo, now suddenly we have the acceptance of Shinto participation, and we have various allusions to the need for Shinshu to be part of society as a whole. And this is how Unkanji, in some sense, creates its kind of normative, regularized status, right? So the question is, can a church function in society which starts off from this radical position in a way that allows it to maintain that voice? And do they need to maintain that voice? Now, when we move to the Edo period, things get a lot, I would say, worse, or a lot more intensely going in the rapprochement direction. So, just to stand back a little bit from this, in India, the Buddhist Sangha was able to be recognized as a kind of extraterritorial entity that is stood outside the rules of society, the laws of society. The Buddhist Sangha policed its own. They were not subject to the laws of the state. They had their own laws and their own regulations, and they had their own trials, and people were punished. And generally in India, this is recognized by the state, and they were allowed to do this. When we move to China, this becomes problematic because there was no history of any group in China ever standing outside the laws of the state. And it took a couple hundred years, but the Buddhists lost this battle, okay? So the first 300-400 years of Buddhism in China, the North and the South are different in this way. The Southern Buddhists maintained their independence, okay? And a very famous essay written about the fact that Buddhist monks should not bow before a king. A king should bow before the monk. After all, who's higher? Who has the authority? Todaiji. Who builds Todaiji? Shomu Tenno.
What happens at the opening ceremony of Todaiji? Does anybody know? What does the emperor and his wife do? They resign their position as king and queen and ordain as Buddhist monks and nuns, because they want to attend the opening of Todaiji as a professional Buddhist, right? As a member of the clergy. This is a recognition of the fact that they are not gods, right? It's a recognition of the fact that they need salvation like everybody else. Okay? So that's the model. And after that, you have this repeated norm in which Japanese emperors always became Buddhist monks at the end of their lives, as did their many wives, okay? It's a very common thing, it's a very common relationship, but nonetheless, Buddhism had a kind of authority there. Now when you get to the Edo period, this starts to change. And why this changes is unclear to me. Without reading all these quotes, starting in the late 18th century, we begin to see this obo bukpo thing, that is the two wings of a bird, you know, the King's Law and the Buddhist Law working together in harmony. And of course, most of you probably know that during the Edo period, social program of the Edo Bakufu, of course, the Buddhist temples perform government-like functions, you know, census, right? Even collecting taxes, public education, all sorts of things. And so the fact that Buddhism and the state are working together hand in hand, it makes perfect sense in that environment. But we also know that because of the anti-Christian laws starting in 1630, every Japanese family was required by law to register with the Buddhist temple to prove they were not Christians. The result of that is that we have a huge inflation in the number of priests and temples to register everybody, right? And the result of that is that we have, I can't give you a number, but a very large number of Buddhist priests who are not well respected by society because they're simply seen as bureaucrats. In other words, they're hired because there's a need for having that many more Buddhist temples, so every family can have a place to register without going over the mountain to do so. So we come into the Meiji period, we have a huge number of temples and priests where people are not necessarily terribly religiously committed, but they've been doing this for generations, right? And there's an income associated with it. Now, this Hirata Atsutani person that I mentioned starts this very strong anti-Buddhist rhetoric. Long before the Meiji period, we have examples of persecution of Buddhism at the hands of what we call Shinto nativists, okay? So Kokugaku, which is Motori Norinaga, starts out as simply as an academic kind of discipline, gets transformed into a very kind of hyper-nationalistic program under Hirata's leadership, in which Buddhism becomes suspect simply because it's foreign. So that's when I think we begin to see a very strong accommodation where the Buddhists are saying, well, the two truths of Buddhism really are the same as the King's Law and Buddha's Law. That's where we begin to see this shift. And I have a whole bunch of quotes here, but basically that's what they're doing. So when we get into the Meiji period, now suddenly we not only have the two things conflated as one. Of course, when they're conflated as one, what is lost? What is lost is that the idea that the original meaning of the two truths, which is that the worldly truth is the truth that we know, the kind of discriminatory truth, right, the analytical truth, and then the other truth, which is the higher nirvanic truth, it just disappears. Particularly in Shinshu, the religious truth, the higher truth, is defined as Tariki Shinjin. So you have Tariki Shinjin, which actually the way it's described is just as analytical as a worldly truth. So that means the higher truth just disappears, it evaporates, okay? And the worldly truth is sacrificed to the need to be politically acceptable to society. So the anti-Buddhist rhetoric of the early Meiji government leads to some very, very strong response from Shinshu. Let me read to you this famous quote from Kyonyo. The leader of Honpa Honganji, that is Nishi Honganji, who in his final testament before dying in 1871 explains the importance of accepting his debt to the emperor, whose light illuminates everything it touches, including the Buddhist Dharma. This is emperor worship used to justify his professional commitment to Buddhism, as if he needs an excuse for this. For the next 75 years, the meaning of the two-truth doctrine is debated among Shin scholars. based on various interpretations of the traditional exegetic thinking in East Asia, but always returning to the basic theme of the worldly truth of Buddhism, has always meant to designate the law of the land, the law of the state. That is, social convention and ethical norms represented by the emperor somehow. Following the edicts of society, hewing to ethical and political norms demanded by the state thereby constitutes good religious behavior. Only with the end of World War II was this spell broken, and only in recent years has this problem gained attention among Shin scholars, which has led to critical writing on it. You know, Nishihon Ganji in Japan has actually had a group working on this problem in recent years. They published at least one book on this that I know. However, I was also told that, and I don't know if this is true, that they're going to publish another book which clarifies the Nishi Honganji position, which is that, in fact, the worldly truth means the truth of the state and the truth of society. In other words, they're going to essentially go back to this traditional model, okay? And they're going to enshrine it now as the official doctrine of the church. So you can find out about that. That's what I heard. So now let's talk a little bit about, in the 2 minutes left, what Kyozawa thought about this. So, in 1894, Kyozawa begins to talk about two truths in a completely new way. He famously glosses Shinran's statement about being neither monk nor layman as this. This is Kyozawa's words: exterior lay, but internally monastic. At the point of his diagnosis of tuberculosis, he had been fully committed to his minimum possible lifestyle, which of course weakened him physically. You know, he's eating pine cone resin or something. Incredible. So, the essay we're going to read tomorrow called Bukyosha Ikanzo Jicho Cesaria, translated as Why Do Buddhists Lack Self-Respect? Here, Kyozawa brings up the topic of the two truths, stating that Buddhists all live in two worlds at the same time, namely, what is in this world and what is beyond this world, or the world's of ultimate truth and worldly truth, or their absolute and their relative. The language perfectly matches the Indic concepts of Laukika, worldly, and Lokota, the ultimate. And it is a clear example of how he had already moved away from Shin normative thinking by this time. Moreover, the essay itself is quite explicit in how weak and unspiritual the clergy is, implying that it is because they have lost the meaning of the two truths. And the worldly truth for Kyozawa is clearly explained here as a pursuit of the goal which ends in attachment to worldly things, hardly the norms of social thinking, right? Now, I think you'd be further from the concept of jindo, the proper way of mankind, which was often used in government directives at this time, in which the individual is encouraged in every way as possible to form attachments to the state and to the emperor as its symbolic leader. So Kyozawa dies in 1902, 1903, by the way. So this is very much still middle to late Meiji. This essay is also significant in that it contains, to my knowledge, the first explicit criticisms of the lack of commitment to practice in Japanese Buddhism. At this time, the ultimate truth is clearly defined in Shin teachings as a sense of peace and confidence, anjin, okay? Anjin and shinjin are, essentially synonyms. And what is your anjin? What is your confidence in? It's in your rebirth in the Pure Land upon death, right? Since that rebirth was not dependent on any kind of achievement in practice and the worldly truth had been given to government for its own purposes, in essence, there was little or no practice left in Jodo Shinshu. Quote, although they expound the lofty teachings of Kegon and Tendai, they do not attempt to cultivate those practices. He's talking about Buddhist monks in general. Assuming that those forms of practice are impossible, Buddhism has been reduced to something useless, akin to offering a painting of rice cake to someone who's hungry. Got that? In the end, truly living religious wisdom and virtue can only flow from the head and belly of someone engaged in practice. Kyozawa also skillfully dismisses the Mappo doctrine as an excuse not to practice, and then recognizes the great advances in scholarship in the Edo and Meiji periods, but asserts that this has had a terrible side effect of thinking that Buddhism demanded nothing more than scholarship. In comparison with his 1895 article on evolution, in which he was positive about its inevitable results, by 1898, Kyozawa was now seeing all sorts of theories and isms as dead ends, but not so much in a philosophical sense as in a religious sense. He then writes a consolation beyond ethics, Rindi Ijo no Anni, and a foundation beyond ethics, Rindi Ijo no Konkyo. And finally, in 1903, just months before his death, he concludes with a powerful essay, Negotiating Religious Morality and Common Morality. Here we have what might be the crowning height of Kyozawa's critical thinking, for he holds back nothing in showing us the inherent impossibility of any moral path, both because its values are hard to rationalize in a universal way, and because even when clarified, these values are well nigh impossible to implement. But this is all to the good, because it is only by means of failing at judicial pursuit that one has invested a significant amount of himself in, that one can therefore turn and find out how to open the door of Taiki. Although the essay echoes other criticisms of Honganji's two-truth interpretation, this last essay is particularly persuasive in an attempt to use the unassailably authoritative writings within the Shinshu canon to mount an academic criticism of the church itself. The result is an unambiguous deconstruction of morality as a religious end in and of itself, but also an unambiguous affirmation of the existential psychology that goes into making Pure Land faith vital for modern society. I'm out of time. So, I guess let me just conclude then by saying that we have a situation in which Kyozawa doesn't point to kind of intellectual conclusion here that would solve the problem, okay? In other words, there's no easy solution to the problem. What Kyozawa wants is something like Kierkegaard, if you know Kierkegaard's writings. That is, the ultimate salvation, the ultimate liberation must come from exhausting your intellectual pursuits. And this, of course, is all on the level of worldly truth, right? You study and work and practice and try to make sense of what you can of the Buddhist teachings to the point that you have reached the end. And only when you have truly reached the end in an existential way, right, can you really hear the Dharma, can you really hear the other side, that ultimate truth. That's what Kyozawa was looking for. But it can't be done simply by some intellectual persuasion, okay? It has to be done in a way that involves the whole being, right? The whole reason that I'm alive. That's what Kyozawa was really aiming for. And for him, that must involve practice. And it must involve practice that pushes you sort of beyond your known limitations, right? Just like sitting, doing Zen at a sesshin, right? When you go beyond where you ever thought you could go. It doesn't have to be Zazen, but it has to be something, right? It takes you beyond. In a sense, all of us who have the ability to think rationally and analyze and do scholarship, for example, it's even harder for us because we find other ways to rationally explain what's going on. And Kyozawa himself talks about that that's a problem for him. And therefore, he can't just accept anything on faith. That's his weakness, he says. You know, like the Myokonin, those people, they just make geta and they chant Namu Amida Butsu and they're fine, you know. Kyozawa says, I can't do that. I simply can't do that, you know. And I suspect most of us can't do that. And back to what I was talking about at the very beginning, you know, now where are we? Here, 2016, you know, Buddhism gets more and more marginalized from everyday life. My students at Cal, their parents are all telling them, oh, you want to study Buddhism, you want to study Japanese, fine, don't major in it. Do it as a hobby. So it's a conundrum, it's not easy, it's not tricky, and it seems to be more and more kind of a specialized, tiny little thing. And yet, when people see how powerful it is, it opens up everything, right? You know, Steve Jobs goes to India and invents an Apple computer, you know. This is tremendous potential here, but it has to, the real breakthrough has to occur in a way that involves some kind of hitting a wall, right, and having some kind of a breakthrough. I think in that sense, there's no real change now from what there was 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. The difficulty is simply that there's so many more diversions. There's so many more other paths to take. There's so many more things promised to you. There's so many, the allure of happiness through material progress is so much more intense now. But the core values of the heart of that are really the same. Anyway, that's my thoughts for today. I hope that was meaningful in some way. Anyway, thank you.
Since if you have a time, can we have a? Okay, so we'd like to have a kind of short, like a Q&A session. If you have any comments or questions to Sensei.
Where does the sense of grace come into this?
Well, so I'm going to throw this back at you. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that term, so maybe you could explain what you mean by grace.
Well, it's just a convenient term I've adopted because, you know, as much as there's obviously, you know, this sense of assertion or some effort, but also there's this kind of sense of this realization that all of the efforts that I presume to have applied were pretensions of accomplishing anything.
Right.
And within that, there's this sense of, well, I adopted this term, grace.
Grace.
I don't know what the
So by grace, you're referring to this sort of tabiki,
Hi.
right? This, the butsudiki, the will, the intentionality of the Buddha in some sense. Yeah. I think the way to sort of echo the Kyozawa line, and I think Soga has basically the same perspective, and probably Kango as well, is that we really shouldn't say too much about what the Buddha thinks, or what grace, how grace functions from the Buddha's perspective, because that's the ultimate truth, right? Unless we're Buddhas, and until we attain nirvana, it's almost better not to talk about it. More important is figuring out how to break through the dilemmas that you were just talking about, getting through the pretense, right? And in that sense, you know, I think there's a continuous need for practice. There's a continuous need for self-evaluation and taking stock of where I am and what I'm doing again. I suppose the answer to that is, in some sense, there's some presumption of faith here, right? That there is a Buddha, that there is the Dharma, that there is truth. And as you get glimpses of it through experience, then you feel there's a confirmation of that knowledge. But how that really works and what that really means, I myself, I don't like to talk about it. I can tell you what the sutras say, but the sutras themselves are unclear. You know, I think again, because there's an inherent, it's a paradox here between how I think, how we think in an analytical way, even if we try to think not analytically, right? And how Buddhists think, and what this kind of Buddha language or Buddha communication is about, which involves this sort of infinite compassion, right? Which is a kind of grace, certainly, you're right in that. But I don't know, I don't have infinite compassion. I mean, somebody came up and asked me for money to take the bus home tonight, I didn't give her money. Oh, geez, I failed again. Talk to my wife every day, I failed again. So it's just like, you know, I know that I'm here, and I'm not up there, and so, but this, I think what's beautiful about Shinchu is this awareness of the limitations of being here, right? Of being in this kind of limited analytical mind frame, but still being able to bump up against the wall and feel the Buddha on the other side. But beyond that, I'm very hesitant to say much about it. You know, I think my job is to simply try to be as clear as I can about what I'm doing. So anyway, yeah.
I think most of us, you know, have learned Buddhism in translation. And to explain it to new people, you know, Americans, you know, in 2016 culture, you know, coming from a different religion perhaps to Buddhism, the translations don't seem to work. They don't resonate.
Sure.
How long did it take, or how true to Sanskrit are the Buddhist, the Chinese Buddhist, you know, writings, translations? You know, I mean, when you
Well, that's Chinese. Now we got to put that
right,
into English,
then
right?
to Japanese and then to English. So,
Right.
do we need the translation? I guess is my question.
Well, I think you do, unless you can read Sanskrit, speak Sanskrit, which nobody has done for even in the Buddhist time. You know, by the way, the Buddha did not speak Sanskrit.
Right.
The Buddha spoke Magadhi, and then his writings were translated into Sanskrit. Even in India, there was a lot of translation going on. All the Mahayana sutras are written in this kind of weird language we call hybrid Sanskrit, and then some of them were translated into proper Sanskrit, and then they come to China in all these different linguistic forms, you know. And now, we used to think that the Chinese word for Sanskrit meant Sanskrit, but now we know it doesn't. It just means Indian language. There were many languages coming in. The Chinese had a really hard time. Look, I know it's difficult, because I completely agree with you, the translations don't resonate, they're hard to understand, but the Chinese worked on this for 500 years, you know? It went from the 3rd century all the way up to the 8th, 9th century, they were still doing it, you know? So it's a very difficult process, and it takes a long time to translate something well. And the larger sutra, for example, was translated, according to this medieval Japanese historian Gyoden, it was translated 13 times into Chinese. Why would they do that? Even today, we still have 5 translations extant. 5. Now, why was it translated? Why do we have, so there's probably at least 10 translations. Why was it done so many times? Well, people read it and they said, this doesn't resonate with me. I don't understand it. Or another guy shows up from India and says, oh, that's the wrong version of the text. This is the right version. You need this one. Okay? I'll give you an example of this. This is a little disturbing for people who believe in Pure Land Buddhism, because we don't want the sutras to change, right? At least the sutras should be, you know, consistent. They're not. So this is another kind of problem, but the earliest translation, okay, of the larger sutra, which is the main text, right, for everybody in Pure Land, all Pure Land thinkers. In the earliest translation, which we have from China, the Amitabha Buddha dies in the Pure Land. That is, Amitabha is not eternal. At that time, Buddhas were long-living humans, okay, with supernatural abilities. You could create a Pure Land, and you could live there, and you could reside there, and you could help people get reborn there, and bring them in, and talk to them during meditation, and do all sorts of amazing things. But you were still mortal. Buddhas were mortal. Shakyamuni was mortal, right? And guess what happens when Amitabha dies in the Pure Land? He hands it off to his assistant, Kanno. Kanno then runs Amitabha's Pure Land, okay? He's the second shacho. He's the second. That's right there in the sutra. Now what happens with the later translations? That problem disappears. Amitabha lives forever. So, clearly that was problematic. Now, as a historian, I look at that and I say, okay, this doctrine's evolving, okay? That conception was not credible, or not convincing or something, right? So what's happening is that Buddhism itself is undergoing pulls and pushes, right? To conform to something that fits in what people are believing, just like when the Chinese are inventing sutras in China, pretending they come from India, the same thing. The same thing even happens in Japan. The Japanese also write sutras in Japan. You know, I discovered a text documenting people who chant the nimbus and get reborn in the Pure Land that was written in Heian period in Japan, and the text is all about people in India. It even tells you where in India they were born, and all their Indian names. The whole thing is absurd. Nobody in Japan had ever been to India, okay? This is a complete fantasy, you know, but it's fascinating, right? It shows the process, the need to be creative, and the need to add something to what we have in our canon, with the creative input is always there. And that's what everybody does today. That's what all you're doing, that's what I'm doing. I think that's a natural process and a good process. I think, you know, instead of assuming that the Bible or the sutras are a fixed entity and they contain the truth and everything in there is true, we should think of this as a creative process that evolves over time, that everybody is adding to. And that's why the Buddhist canon can get bigger. So the Contemplation Sutra, the Kangyo, is, like I said, we're pretty certain it was written probably in Turfan or somewhere in northwestern China, and it becomes the most well-studied Pure Land Sutra in China, more than the larger sutra. Everybody writes about it, not just Pure Land people, everybody. Why? Because it has a Chinese dimension to it. You know, it's essentially about visualization meditation, coming today with Vajrayana, you know, with Tibetan Buddhism, but that was a core Pure Land idea. So you know, this is something, that's what's happening at the time. People are attracted to it, they're drawn into it, and from that they draw things out. And that's where Nembutsu, by the way, is also invented. As we think, that recitation Nembutsu comes out of the Contemplation Sutra, that Shandao who recognizes it and says this is representative of something much bigger, right? So that's part of that conception. Namo Amida Butsu, that's the first time it appears, you know? So it's a very, you know, again, if we trace this back to India as a historian, does it have to be Indian for it to be real? Absolutely not. Because even in India, there's no truth. There's no true origin that we can identify. I mean, for example, one of the greatest, we have no Theravadan Buddhists here. But I know I can see anyway. You know, one of the greatest myths, and I use myth in a negative sense here, that's been perpetrated on the West, is that somehow the Buddhism of Southeast Asia, Burma, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, Theravadan Buddhism is the original Buddhism. It's just complete bullshit. Total bullshit. Now, why did they do that, and how did they succeed at that? You still see that today, by the way. There's absolutely nothing about Theravadan Buddhism that predates Mahayana. Nothing. Everything in Theravada Buddhism is in the Chinese canon. There's certainly a lot of things that are not Mahayana in there, but that's all translated into Chinese. The Chinese translations of the same material is older than any of the texts that come out of Sri Lanka. Older. Because they didn't have printing. And they didn't have paper. So they wrote on palm leaves. And palm leaves only last 100 years and then they fall apart. And then it has to be copied again. And in fact, you can see all sorts of evidence of editing of these early Pali texts in the Theravada canon. This is all invented by Buddhaghosa. Buddhaghosa's 5th century. Nirvana Sutra and Larger Sutra are translated already by the 4th century. They're earlier texts, okay? So, this is just another story, you know? I mean, it helps them to say we're the older Buddhism. It helps them to exclude all the other forms of Buddhism because they can't understand it. They don't want to understand it. We have a graduate student at Berkeley, by the way, at Cal, who's researching Vajrayana, esoteric Buddhist evidence in Sri Lanka. She found a stupa with the whole description of a Vajrayana practice in Sri Lanka, okay? There's all sorts of images of Kandon all over the place. So Sri Lanka had a big Mahayana presence for a while. They got rid of it. It doesn't fit their narrative. Certainly by the 9th, 10th century, there's lots of evidence of Mahayana in Sri Lanka. That means in Burma, in Thailand, everywhere. It was everywhere. So this is just another story, you know. Everybody has a story to tell. So this story works for Sri Lanka, and works for Burma and Thailand, that's fine. And the Shinshu story works for Japan, that's fine too. You know, we're all involved in this. We're all complicit, I guess.
Co-conspirator.
Yeah, co-conspirator.
Okay. You know, given your knowledge of this history of Buddhism from India, China, Japan, how do you see Buddhism in the West developing from here on, you know, if you look in your crystal ball?
Well, you know, there are a lot of good things about Buddhism in the West. There are a lot of problems, obviously, as well. I think it's really young. There's a lot of innovative, weird stuff going on that I have a hard time identifying as Buddhist. But
For example?
Let's talk about eco-Buddhism, for example.
Oh,
Eco-Buddhism is a really popular subject for a lot of people who are die-hard ecology people, and they base their ecological activism on Buddhism, right? And it's really big in Europe, okay? And it's now come from Europe to here, it's come from here to Asia. In Thailand now they're ordaining trees, okay? I'm sorry, it's a little wacky, you know? This is not a Thai traditional notion. There's nothing in Buddhism that makes a tree sacred. This is a Western idea. You know, nature is sacred. And a lot of the eco-Buddhism people love Japan because they think Japan really understood nature is sacred. But really? The sacred is in nature, but to say everything in nature is sacred, that's a whole other thing. So eco-Buddhism is a kind of modern invention of Western culture from people who want to find a justification for being strong activists, even politically, active, to protect the environment. So their desire to protect the environment is, of course, laudable. We all are happy about that. But don't exploit Buddhism for that, in Buddhism, rupa, the physical world has no sacred value. Rupa is just rupa, it's just wood, it's totally neutral. If anything, the physical world is dangerous because if it's beautiful, you get attached to it, and then that causes delusion, and then, you get messed up. It's the source of bono, right? It itself is not bono, but it could be bono, right? It could be the source of enlightenment, like Dogen talks about a leaf falling off the tree and somebody having satori, satori, that's okay. It could also be the source of awakening, but it's just rupa. It's just materiality. Materiality has no inherent good or bad quality to it. That's the traditional Buddhist way of thinking. So you can talk about a kami in Mount Fuji. I suppose you could talk about a kami in Mount Shasta if you think that way. That's okay with me, but I wouldn't say Mount Shasta is sacred. I don't know. And you can, but that's not Buddhist. So I'm just saying those are some odd things like that. Strange modern forms. It's not just the West. Sorry, Mark, I'm going to just extend this to Japan. So one of the things that happens in Japan is that you hear this Kuei Isho thing that somehow I'm going to go to the Pure Land and see my family there. Where does this come from? I'm always arguing with the Jodosha. Jodosha people say this all the time, and I know Shinju people say this too. I'm sorry, I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's certainly not in the scriptures, okay? This is an added value. This is an added interpretation. That people want to feel that the Pure Land is a destination where all the separation that have happened to me will be resolved, will be fixed, right? I don't know. I myself could never expound that doctrine, but I know a lot of people are really happy to hear that. So if you want to say, what's that?
Heaven.
Heaven, yeah, it becomes heaven. Essentially, that's what it is. So I understand that, it's convenient to use that kind of rhetoric, but the Pure Land is not heaven. It's a different kind of goal. It's a different kind of thing, and it's a whole different mechanism here. It's a whole different kind of religious outlook. So the level of the reward may be the same as heaven. But what it is something entirely different. And you don't get to the Pure Land simply by being a pious person. That's another kind of thing you gotta watch out for. It's very clear in the sutras that simply being pious doesn't get you nirvana. Right. You gotta have an awakening. You gotta see the bigger truth, the transcendent truth, the non-analytic truth. Simply being a good person, obeying the rules, and being pious isn't gonna do it. That's why Kyozawa's critique is not only about common morality, it's also about religious morality, because even religious morality for Kyozawa must result, honestly, in a dead end. Because you cannot succeed at it. If you think you will succeed at it, you're deluding yourself. Because even if, first of all, it's hard enough to know what's good and what's bad, which changes every 20 years, right? If you have an international life and you go from country to country, that gets even worse, right? Gee, you watch these jokes on TV now, these women telling jokes about sexuality, my God, my mother would faint if she heard that, So, these things change over time, so how can you know what actually is moral or not? It's very difficult, right? So Kyozawa says, first of all, that makes any moral judgment relative. But even if you somehow transcend that problem, and you say, okay, this is right, and this is wrong, and this is good, and this is bad, and I know what to do, then try to do it, try to live that way. Try to give bus money to everybody who asks you for it. Most of you won't do it, I won't do it, so you fail, So it's just, I was reading about Dharmapala. You guys know who Dharmapala is? Oh man, what a story. So this guy Dharmapala comes out of Sri Lanka. He comes to Japan in 1887 with Alcott, with this theosophy thing, and he becomes this hero in Europe and America as this representative. This is when the Europeans and Americans are just learning about Buddhism. The first journal of Buddhism ever published in the United States is published out of Santa Cruz. The Buddhist Ray, it was called, R-A-Y. And then we have a Shinshi journal out of San Francisco, like 1900, 1902, something like that. Anyway, the Europeans, the Westerns don't know what the hell Buddhism is. So this guy goes on a speaking tour all the time, and he lives like a monastic, but he's not a monastic. And he he first comes to Japan, and the Japanese really, you know, applaud him and support him, and then he talks about Buddhism, and they think, what? And then he comes again and again. Now by his fourth trip, it's like, forget it. Nobody goes to see him, no one talks to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about because he's reading everything in English. He doesn't read Pali, he only reads English. And so in the 1880s, 1890s, what is there on Buddhism in English? It's all Theravada stuff. It's all, this is the original Buddhism stuff, you know. And so the Japanese realize it's absurd. He doesn't know what he's saying. But his life is a phenomenal example of somebody who's living at a time when nobody knows what Buddhism is. So he says, I'm the Buddhist, you know, and then everyone says, okay, he must be the Buddhist. So, except for people who are Buddhists, who then say, what are you talking about? So, you know, we're all sort of going through various difficulties. But I think, you know, we have to be open-minded. We have to, for example, remember there are 5 translations of the larger sutra available to us, you know, that we should very much avoid a kind of narrow, one-size-fits-all view of what Buddhism is, even what a sutra is, even what Shinran is, you know. We have Shinran, and then we have the way Shinran has been understood and discussed and represented through time. And that's a much more complex topic. So, you know, when Kyonyo says your job is to, and because it's the emperor that I was able to study Buddhism, well, I suppose it's nice to see that level of humility, but it's kind of an odd statement, you know. That's certainly nothing that Shinran would say. Okay. So, is that okay? Sure, it's okay. I'm not in a position to say it's good or it's bad, but that has consequences, right? That has real consequences. That brings Shin, you know, into a kind of politically conservative orthodoxy, that suddenly Shin is obligated to support the state in a way, and there's something lost when you do that, yeah.
What do you think Shinran's appreciation of Shotoku was based on?
I think Shinran's appreciation of Shotoku was based on his view of Shotoku as a kind of bodhisattva who brought Buddhism to Japan. Not necessarily that he was, you know, the regent and ran the country. The fact that he was also regent was meaningful because he was able to implement Buddhism in state policy, right? I think that's what Shinran's view of Buddhism, Shotoku was. So it's certainly okay to revere Shotoku or Ashoka. You know, these are great heroes. And the China has them as well. And these are, you know, they're great people like this. But we have to take stock of our situation. I think American Buddhism can actually be a great thing, by the way, Marley. I think it will be a great thing. It's going to take time, it's going to take humility, it's going to take study. I would like to see more practice, more practice. It doesn't have to be Nenbutsu. I really think that this Kyozawa's call for practice has a lot of meaning and bring people back into doing something. Let me tell you, we had a Tibetan Lama, sort of well-known Tibetan Lama, speak on campus a couple of weeks ago. And it was funny because he said, I want to talk about vegetarianism. This is very important. Now, Tibetan Buddhism is not traditionally vegetarian because they don't have vegetables in Tibet. It's not his fault, you know, just the way it is. No, they're meat eating, you know. But he said, that's a new thing in Tibetan Buddhism is to be vegetarian. And there's a whole political backstory to this. But what I want to say is that he said, this is the message I want to bring to the students at University of California, Berkeley, which is a great school, and I respect you all, and you have a great reputation. And they rented a big lecture hall in the biology building for him. And I looked around the room, and there was maybe 300 people there, maybe 30 students. 270 was in the faculty, and 265 people were devotees of Tibetan Buddhism. And so as soon as he finished his talk, they all raised their hand and they said, well, what about this ritual that we're supposed to do every day in which we offer meat, you know, to the Buddha and to the gods and stuff? And so he kind of had us wiggle around trying to answer that question, right? He said, well, it doesn't have to be real meat, it could be fake meat, you know. He's trying to, I mean, the point is that why are all these people coming to hear him? Because they're already involved in Tibetan Buddhism. What's their response to his talk? They talk about their practice. That's what they talk about. They talk about how this perspective affects my practice. This is stuff that people are doing or trying to do every day. This is why Soka Gakkai has succeeded. Because there's a daily practice. you know, and it's not that this practice is better than that practice. From my perspective, it's having the discipline that comes from practice, you know, and this is the kind of thing that Shin in America isn't strong at.
Yeah, right, honest.
No, I'm just curious, if you've heard of this thing that Nagao Gajin was promoting as the 5 pillars of Buddhism, and the 5th one is going to be here in the West.
Oh, really?
Of these significant developments of Buddhism's movement through from India to China and so forth, and the Kamakura, and then the 5th he was anticipating will be this kind of resurgence or whatever.
Well, I didn't know about that, but I understand what you're saying. I mean, here's the thing about Buddhism in the West, and this is the real opportunity part. Is that what's different also about the Meiji period is the Japanese are meeting people like Dharma, right? And what we have here is the same thing times 10. The whole world is here. You can have 15 kinds of Buddhism interacting with each other in a way that had never happened before. You know? And you can, in some sense, pick and choose what works, right? There's a freedom here. And the Japanese Buddhist community is the oldest Buddhist community in America, so you guys have a well-grounded faith, you have an institution, and you have a great opportunity to open yourselves up to all sorts of interesting stuff happening. I think that's the Buddhism that Nagao Sensei was talking about. I know Nagao Sensei was very devout. I had dinner at his house once in which we chanted Nembusa for 15 minutes before dinner. Oh, wow. Yeah, it was serious.
Why do you think Chinese Buddhism, I mean, because Chinese Buddhism historically is older, I mean, as far as being introduced to the West, but it just somehow hasn't, I mean, now it's kind of developing, but given its long history, it hasn't had the same kind of development as, let's say, the Japanese, well, BC8, for example.
I don't know, you know, the history, but I can guess. My guess would be that the reason that the BCA is successful is because you had a lot of institutional support from Japan. First, you have a lot of institutional support in Hawaii, and then a lot of that comes over here. And you have ministers coming from Japan, you have money coming from Japan, this is understanding. And also you have strong Buddhist communities in Japan coming over and recognizing the value of that culture and wanting to put it together. It was the Chinese that came over, probably came over, well, not probably, they came over at a time when Chinese society is really disrupted and unstable, and those kind of communities probably just were not that strong. You know, the positive aspect of Shinshu that's different, say, from Chinese Buddhism is still basically a monastic Buddhism. So the idea of family temples, parish temples, is not a strong tradition in China. Even today, when the temples are for monks and nuns. And you can go to the temple, but most people don't have an easy mechanism for going on a daily basis. In that sense, Shinshu is really special. And the trouble is, that if you're not careful, the family side of it comes to dominate the religion, and then the other side of it, the practice side of it, the study side of it, slowly starts to disappear. So, I mean, I don't know how to solve that problem either, but I think there's a great opportunity here because, well, for example, American Buddhism is not celibate, you know. Monks and nuns in American Buddhism fail, and they don't want to be celibate. They don't, you know, they like practice. They'll shave their heads. You know, I have good friends who live in Green Gulch, this San Francisco Zen Center, kind of rural, they have a farm and all that. But they're married, you know. They shave their heads and they wear robes and they do zazen every day, but they're married. You know, they want to have essentially a family Buddhist culture. So in that sense, Shinshu is the model for that. It's the best model, and the Soto Shu borrowed the model of the Shinshu. I mean, if you look at the way, you know, Soto monks accepted marriage in the Meiji period, there's a big debate about it, and in the end, you know, a lot of the hardliners said, no, we can't do this, we can't do this, but then someone stood up and said, wait a minute, we're already doing it. So they just gave up, you know? Yeah, so, I mean, I think in that sense, Shinshu has a great head start. But you have to somehow bring the practice back in. Even if it's a practice that not everybody's required to do, but just setting up, you know, for example, like in the case of Zen, you have Zazenkai. You could have Zazenkai in a Shin temple as well. Just some kind of meditation group that anyone's welcome to come in and do once a week or something for an hour. Anything that allows people to participate. This is what gets me when these Tibetan teachers come to Cal to give talks, and the the members, the believers come, they all talk about their practice. They're all engaged in practice. Their knowledge of Buddhism is sketchy, okay? Sometimes strong, sometimes pretty weird. But they're all engaged in practice. And if you go, I spoke at the San Francisco Zen Center retreat in Tasahara last summer, and that was quite an experience. I spoke at San Quentin Prison a few months ago. That was also quite an experience. What is the Buddhist group in San Quentin Prison? Is it Jodo Shinshu? No, it's Zen. Okay, they're doing Zazen, and it's good. It's strong Zen. You know, these guys are avid sitters. You know, because it really means a lot to them, and they're really happy that I could come and give a talk. And so it's a practice, and they don't have a lot of study. They don't have a lot of background. But you know, Honen has this famous in Jodo Shu was famous anyway. With this monk Myohen, where Myohen's a very famous, like, Shinkon, Koyasan guy, does all these funny things, and he says, yeah, I heard about your teaching, but they're really simple, and I don't know if it's enough, you know. I'm not sure that Nembutsu really has that power, you know. And Honen says to him, why don't you just try it for a week, you know. Just try doing Nembutsu every day, seriously, for a week, and get back to me. And Myohen says, okay, I'll try it. And he becomes a big devotee of Honen. It's a great story, you know. Here's a guy who's, again, he's overeducated. He's been doing all these different things, and he kind of finds Nembutsu. He knows about Nembutsu. They have Nembutsu on Koyasan at that time, but he doesn't. But it's only when he encounters Honen that he really gets the kind of clear, precise, articulate message. And when he follows that path, suddenly all this stuff opens up to him. So it's powerful. It's beautiful stuff. You know? The Myokoni, they're not reading the Larger Sutra. I don't think they read at all. I mean, that's why the Myokoni are so amazing, right? It's just their practice, right? It's their piety coming through their practice. And it's Nembutsu all day long, at any moment, all the time. You know? It's powerful, it's beautiful. It doesn't make sense. It's often irrational, but it's, you know, it's very moving, right? So, I mean, I think that's somehow what you want to make available to people, and you have to have it in the temples. You have to have, the temple has to be a place where people identify as a place where this kind of Nembutsu culture is going, right? That it's alive. There's a flame burning there. You know? When you do that, I don't know, but that's my view of things. I think, you know, once that can be done somehow, there's going to be a lot of interest.
Yeah. What's your view of the so-called practice cliche of hearing the Dharma?
Yeah, what does that mean? I mean, hearing the Dharma in some senses, I think that's it's obviously understood differently by different people. So, Ron, why don't you talk about that a little bit, how hearing the Dharma is a kind of practice?
Well, that's why it's a cliche that we tend to use that as what is your practice?
Right.
And, you know, we use the other one of everyday life.
Right.
But, you know, hearing the Dharma is, again, not that intellectual process,
Right.
but just, in a way, it's more of a reflective way of looking and experiencing, and we say appreciating life.
Yeah, I think I understand hearing the Dharma in a slightly different way, but close to that. There's something called Ichinengi. Ichinengi, Shinran, by the way, Ichinengi is an interpretive category of different ways of doing Nembutsu. Okay? So after Honen died, you know, within, say, 50 years, we have all these writings about Nembutsu and Honen's doctrine, and different ways to interpret it, what different people are doing. And one of the categories of Nembutsu is called Ichinen. Ichinen means one Nembutsu. The meaning of one Nembutsu is Ichinen. And most people at that time put Shinran in that category. And from that perspective, which is the way I understand it, hearing the Dharma, Monpo, refers to hearing the Dharma and awakening, you know, to Tariki. So it's an experience. In other words, it's not something that you hear every day, but it's rather hearing the Dharma. It's, in other words, Shinran, if you say Shinran is in the one Nembutsu camp, it doesn't mean he only had Nembutsu once in his life. It refers to one Nembutsu as being the one moment when everything came together, when boom, it happened, right? When that's the Satori, that's the awakening. And I think that's what hearing the Dharma means to me. Because I hear the Dharma every day, but I don't necessarily have an awakening every time I hear it, right? So I don't regard hearing the Dharma itself being practiced. I can hear the Dharma all day long, and probably I do, but I don't necessarily have much. It doesn't constitute practice for me, because I can hear the Dharma while I'm thinking about something else, and it doesn't really work. But when I hear the Dharma and I awaken to the Dharma, when Shinran says that one Nembutsu, when everything happens, boom, then that's powerful. Then that's a real Tariki moment. At that point, the Nembutsu is not yours. It's the Buddha's, right? But it's yours as well somehow, right? You know, then everything kind of becomes transcendent and odd. And I think, to me, that's what hearing the Dharma. I think that's what Shinran means when he uses that term. But you're right, it's not often used.